What if everything you've been told about someone is a lie? What if the most feared prisoner on a deep space ship isn't the monster everyone thinks she is, but just a victim of a terrifying secret? Meet Neela, a girl locked away for something she couldn't control, hidden behind a mask of silence. But one man, an unlikely engineer, dared to see her. Now, as the ship's dark secrets begin to unravel, they must escape before it's too late. The galaxy is watching and the truth is about to break free. Will they survive the truth or will they be erased forever? The chase for freedom begins now. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. In the cold, silent reaches of space, far from any stars or planets, the prison ship, the Reluctant Star, drifted through the void. It had been forgotten by most, its purpose obscure to those beyond its walls. The ship was an enormous metal structure, isolated in the cold expanse of the galaxy, where nothing but the hum of machines and the stillness of space filled the silence. Reluctant Star held many prisoners, some dangerous, some forgotten, but one prisoner was different from the rest. Cell 9C was set apart from the others, a dark corner of the ship where few dared to venture. The guards would avoid walking near it, and the other prisoners would only speak of it in hushed whispers. No one talked about the deep cage, but everyone knew of it. Inside, behind thick reinforced walls, sat a prisoner who was feared, though not for what she had done. Her name was Neela, but no one ever called her that. She was known only as the Cursed, the Unseen, or the Beast. The stories about her were strange and terrifying. They said that if anyone looked at her face, they would go mad, that the sight of her would shatter their dreams. The fear wasn't about what she had done, but simply about her appearance. She had been born with golden eyes that shimmered like stars, and her skin had a silver tint that seemed to glow in the dark. It was her very presence that disturbed those around her, making them feel exposed, as though their deepest thoughts and fears were laid bare before her. The truth, however, was not as simple as the rumors. Neela had been locked away not because of her actions, but because of the fear her appearance caused. In the cold, dark cell that was her prison, she sat silently, wrapped in chains. Her hands were bound, her face hidden behind a thick silver mask, with no eyes, no mouth, no expression. The mask was made to keep her from being seen, and in many ways it had worked. For years she had lived like this, isolated, silent, and alone. On the ship, everything was routine. The guards moved in strict patterns, the machinery hummed constantly, and the prisoners followed their daily routines, always under the watchful eyes of their captors. But Neela had long ago stopped following any routine. Her world was the same every day. Darkness, silence, the occasional voice from a guard telling her to stay in her cell. Her life had become a series of endless, monotonous hours. She had no sense of time, only the feeling of cold metal walls surrounding her, the lack of fresh air, and the constant thrum of the ship's engines. One day, however, everything changed. The ship's warden gave a new order. A new crew member had been assigned to fix the ship's failing systems, and this crew member was not like the others. Caleb, an engineer by trade, was sent to the Reluctant Star to repair the life support systems. Caleb was a young man, quiet and efficient, someone who preferred working with machines over talking to people. His job was simple: to fix whatever was broken and to stay out of trouble. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a guard. He was just a worker. When Caleb arrived, he was handed a data tablet with instructions and directed to the lower levels of the ship. Repair the life support and cell mines, the warden had said. And then, as Caleb looked at the tablet, the warden gave him a warning. Don't talk to the thing inside. Caleb wasn't sure what the warden meant, but he didn't ask. It wasn't his place to question orders. He was there to work, and that's exactly what he would do. He made his way down to the lower levels, the metal hallways growing darker and colder the further he walked. As he passed by row after row of locked cells, Caleb could feel the strange tension in the air. The ship felt quiet, unnaturally quiet. as if something was just waiting to break the silence. When he reached cell 9C, the door stood before him, marked with warning signs, flashing red. The life support system in this section had failed, and the warnings on the tablet were urgent. Caleb opened the side panel and began working on the system, the old wires crackling in his hands. The room inside was dark and cold. Caleb felt a shiver run down his spine as he opened the door to enter. The cell was thick with fog, and as the door creaked open, he could barely make out the figure. Inside, she sat in the far corner, still and silent. Her silver mask glinted faintly in the dim light, but her presence filled the room. Caleb could feel her eyes on him, even though he couldn't see her face. He knew she was watching him, and the weight of that gaze made his heart race. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but his eyes kept flicking toward her. He had heard the stories. He had heard the whispers from the guards. But standing here in the silence of this dark cell, Caleb didn't feel fear. He felt something else, something he couldn't quite name. As he worked, Caleb couldn't help but glance up at her. "Don't look," he whispered to himself. But something about her presence drew him in. Her stillness was almost peaceful, and yet there was an unspoken sadness in the room. The longer he worked, the more the silence seemed to press in on him. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the stillness. "What is your name?" The voice was faint, uncertain, but it was enough to make Caleb freeze. He glanced up, unsure of what to do. The warnings flooded his mind, but he couldn't deny the curiosity that stirred within him. "Caleb," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause, and then she responded, "Mine is Neela." Caleb blinked. He wasn't supposed to talk to her. He wasn't supposed to interact with her at all. But something about her name, the way she said it, so quietly, so gently, made Caleb pause. This wasn't the monster they had warned him about. This was someone real. Someone who, despite everything, still remembered how to speak. The tension in the room seemed to fade, and for the briefest of moments Caleb forgot about the warnings, the fear, and the rules. Instead, he felt a strange connection, a bond that he couldn't explain. He finished his work quickly, standing up to leave, but just before he walked out, Neela spoke again. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice soft and full of gratitude. The words hit Caleb harder than he expected. "Thank you for not looking away." As he left the room, Caleb's heart was heavy with something he couldn't name. He had done what he was told, fixed the system, and yet as he walked away from cell 9C, he knew something had changed. Something deep within him had shifted. He didn't see a monster. He saw a prisoner, a girl alone in a cage. Caleb stood in the narrow hallway, the cold metallic walls of the ship pressing in on him from every side. The silence around him was thick, almost suffocating. He could hear the hum of the ship's engines in the distance, but everything else felt dead, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. He had fixed the life support in cell 9C, but couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in his chest ever since he stepped into that dark room. He glanced around, checking the hallway again to make sure no one was watching him. The guards had warned him to stay away from the lower levels, especially the cell where Neela was kept. They had made it clear that she was not like the others, that she was dangerous, that he should not speak to her. But despite all the warnings, despite the fear that still lingered in the back of his mind, Caleb couldn't forget the way she had looked at him, the way her soft voice had echoed in the silence of her cage. The moment her eyes had locked onto his, Caleb felt something change inside him. The fear that everyone else felt, the fear that had been drilled into him since he arrived on the ship, seemed to melt away. In its place was a strange sense of curiosity, mixed with something else, something he didn't fully understand. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of someone else's loneliness. It was a feeling he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he tried. He had only spoken a few words with Neela, but those few words had stayed with him long after he left her cell. He couldn't stop thinking about her name, about her eyes, about the soft gratitude in her voice when she thanked him for not looking away. Something about her haunted him, and he knew he had to return. Later that night, when the ship's lights flickered and the hum of the engines quieted down, Caleb found himself standing in front of Cell 9C again. The air was colder this time, and the silence felt even deeper. He wasn't sure why he was back, but as his feet moved almost instinctively, he found himself standing before the heavy metal door. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out to open the small panel beside it. He knew he wasn't supposed to be there. The guards had warned him. The warden had told him to keep his distance. But something in Caleb told him that he couldn't just walk away. Not after what he had seen. Not after hearing her voice. He glanced around the hallway once more, making sure no one was nearby before stepping closer to the door. As his hand gripped the panel, he felt a wave of unease wash over him. The door clicked open with a soft hiss, and Caleb stepped inside. The room was just as dark and cold as it had been before, the fog still hanging low to the ground, curling around the metal walls like a living thing. The only light came from a small flicker in the corner, where the life support system Caleb had fixed earlier cast a dim, steady glow. And there, in the far corner of the room, Neela sat motionless, just as she had been before. The silver mask on her face glinted faintly in the low light, but she didn't move. Caleb hesitated, unsure of what to do next. For a moment, he just stood there, listening to the silence. His breath felt louder than it should, his heartbeat thudding in his chest. Then, without warning, he heard it, the softest sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Why are you here?" The words made Caleb freeze. It was her voice again. The same soft, careful voice from before. He hadn't expected her to speak, not after everything the guards had told him about her. He glanced at her, his eyes lingering on the mask that covered her face. Her presence filled the room, heavy and quiet. There was a sadness in the air, something he couldn't explain, but it was there, lingering like a shadow. I came to check on the system," Caleb stammered, his voice a little shaky. He hadn't planned on speaking to her, hadn't even considered what he would say if she did talk. The silence between them felt awkward now, but it was too late to back away. "I fixed the life support earlier, but I wanted to make sure everything was okay." Neela's head tilted slightly, a movement that seemed almost imperceptible. Caleb noticed it out of the corner of his eye, but he didn't dare look directly at her face. He didn't want to break the fragile peace that had settled between them, even though every fiber of his being urged him to turn away. After a long pause, Neela spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "You're not afraid." Caleb was taken aback by the statement. He had expected her to say something else, something threatening or strange, but instead, she simply stated the truth. Her tone was curious, like she was trying to understand something she couldn't quite grasp. I'm not afraid of you," Caleb said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He immediately regretted saying it. He had never been one to speak without thinking, especially in situations like this. But as soon as the words left his lips, he realized that it was true. He wasn't afraid. Not of her. Neela remained still, the soft hum of the life support system the only sound between them. Caleb couldn't see her eyes, but he felt their weight on him. He wondered what she was thinking, what was going through her mind as she sat there waiting. For a moment, there was only silence again. Caleb stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. He could feel her presence in the room, like an unseen force, but it wasn't the fearsome presence he had been told to expect. It was something else. Something quieter, more vulnerable. Then, without warning, Neela spoke again, her voice soft and almost hesitant. "I've been alone for so long. I wonder if anyone will ever see me." Her words hit Caleb harder than he expected. He had been so focused on the stories, the warnings, the rumors surrounding her, that he had never stopped to think about what it must be like for her. To be trapped in a cage for something she couldn't control. Something as simple as her appearance. "See you," Caleb said, his voice steady now. He took a deep breath, knowing that he couldn't just walk away. Not now. "And I don't care what you look like." There was a long silence after that. and for a brief moment Caleb thought she might speak again. But instead, Neela's shoulders seemed to relax, her body shifting slightly as if the weight of his words had lifted something inside her. And just as Caleb turned to leave, he heard her say the words that would stay with him forever. "Thank you, Caleb, for not looking away." As the door closed behind him, Caleb stood in the hallway for a long moment, his heart racing. He had only spoken to her for a few minutes, but those minutes had changed something inside him. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew he couldn't forget her. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him, the way she had spoken, to him like he was the only person who had ever really seen her. And deep down he knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The days aboard the prison ship seemed to stretch on endlessly for Caleb. He had done his best to follow orders, to stay out of trouble, but his mind was never far from Neela. The brief moments he had spent with her in cell 9C haunted him, and the more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. She had thanked him. She had spoken to him like no one had ever spoken to her before. And in return, he had done the one thing everyone else had feared. He had seen her, truly seen her. It was clear now that something inside him had shifted. The cold metal walls of the ship, the dim lights, the echo of footsteps in the corridors, they all seemed to fade into the background whenever he thought of her. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. He didn't see a monster in Neela, he saw a person. Someone trapped in a nightmare of her own design, someone with a past that had been erased, hidden away, as though she had never existed. That night, as Caleb lay in his small bunk in the engineering quarters, he couldn't sleep. The sounds of the ship, the low hum of the engines, the faint clank of distant doors, kept him awake, and his thoughts kept returning to Neela. Her name echoed in his mind like a soft whisper, a call he couldn't ignore. Her voice, so fragile yet strong, had spoken to him with a sadness he couldn't forget. She had been locked away for so long, cut off from the world, from everyone. And yet, despite it all, she still held on to something. Hope. A spark that refused to die. He had to know more. Caleb had to understand why Neela was in that cell, why she had been treated the way she had, but every time he tried to dig deeper into her past, the information he found was vague, incomplete, or erased altogether. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that no one would ever know the truth about her. The ship's archive was full of gaps, strange redacted files, and broken links that led to nothing. Most of the crew had never heard of her. They knew her only by the whispers, the rumors of the monster in cell 9C. No one ever questioned why she was locked away. No one seemed to care. But Caleb couldn't stop. He kept searching, going deeper, into the system whenever he had a free moment, trying to bypass the weak security protocols on the ship. He felt like a shadow in the darkness, slipping through unnoticed, trying to uncover the hidden truths that no one else seemed to want to acknowledge. It was on the 5th day after their encounter that Caleb finally uncovered something. A piece of footage, blurry and old, from when Neela was first brought aboard the ship. The recording was grainy and there was no sound, but it was enough to see her. She was young then, her silver skin glowing faintly under the lights, her golden eyes wide and searching. She wasn't the terrifying creature the guards spoke of. She was just a girl, alone, confused, and lost in a world that didn't understand her. Caleb watched the footage, his heart tightening in his chest. She was sitting in the corner of her cell, not doing anything violent or dangerous, just sitting in silence. She had her back to the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them as if trying to protect herself from the world. There was no fear in her eyes, just resignation. She had been abandoned, forgotten, and trapped in a cage built by fear. As the days passed, Caleb's obsession with Neela grew. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting alone in that dark cell, her face hidden behind that silver mask. He had to see her again. He had to know more. One evening, after the ship's routine maintenance shift, Caleb found himself walking toward the lower levels again. This time, he wasn't just doing his job. He wasn't just fixing a broken system or checking the life support. He was going to see her. He didn't know why, but he felt like it was something he had to do. When he reached the familiar hallway, the door to cell 9C stood in front of him like a wall, cold and unyielding. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the panel. He had never felt like this before, not with anything or anyone. There was a pull, something deep inside him that urged him to act, to take the next step. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Caleb stepped inside. The room was just as dark as he remembered, the fog still swirling on the ground. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. It was as if the air itself had changed. He could feel her presence before he even saw her. She was there, in the corner, as she had always been. But this time there was something new, something alive in the air. Neela was sitting with her head tilted as if waiting for him, her silver mask glowing faintly in the dim light. Caleb felt a shiver run down his spine, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, a mix of curiosity, empathy, and something he couldn't name. She didn't speak at first. She just watched him, her gaze intense even through the mask. Caleb felt like she was looking straight into him, seeing all of him, every part of him he had tried to hide, and then without warning she spoke. "You came back." Her voice was soft, fragile, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was the first time he had heard her speak since their brief encounter, and this time, it was different. There was something in her voice, something hopeful, as if she wasn't alone in the world anymore. "I couldn't stay away," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "I needed to know who you are. What happened to you?" Neela didn't answer right away. She just tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. And then, with a small, sad laugh, she spoke again. "You're the first person who hasn't looked away." Caleb's heart clenched at the words. He didn't know why it hurt, but it did. He had been told she was dangerous, that she was a monster. But he saw now that all she had ever wanted was to be seen, to be understood. "You don't deserve to be locked away," Caleb said quietly. "You deserve freedom. You deserve to live." For the first time, Nyla's shoulders seemed to relax. Her body didn't move, but Caleb could sense the change. It was like a weight had been lifted, a moment of hope in a place that had never known it. In that moment, Caleb knew that he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave her behind in that cage, not when he now understood the truth. Neela wasn't a monster. She was just a prisoner, locked away because the galaxy feared what it didn't understand. He didn't know what he would do next, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let her stay in that cell any longer. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was a person, and it was time for her to be seen, to be free. And somewhere deep in the silence of the ship, something inside Neela stirred. For the first time in years, she believed that there was someone who would not turn away. The tension on the ship had grown unbearable. Caleb couldn't ignore it any longer. Every moment spent near Cell 9C felt like he was walking on a razor's edge. He had spent so many days pretending to do his job, fixing machines, checking systems. All the while his mind would wander back to Neela. Her golden eyes, the soft sound of her voice, the feeling of being seen when no one else had cared enough to look. She had stayed in that cell for far too long, locked away for nothing more than the way she looked. But now, Caleb couldn't pretend it was just a mistake. Neela was something different, something powerful. And the galaxy had been wrong to fear her. In the quiet of his quarters, Caleb lay awake staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. The knowledge that he had learned about Neela and her past, how she had been erased from history, her people, hunted down because of their ability to see beyond the surface, kept him up at night. The more he uncovered, the more he understood how twisted the truth really was. The authorities, the Empire, they had hidden this truth because they feared it. They feared the power that came from understanding the depths of another being's soul, from seeing the world with clarity that was too raw for them to handle. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand by and let the system continue to imprison her for a crime she never committed. Neela wasn't dangerous. She was a victim, and someone had to help her escape. The plan had been forming in Caleb's mind for days, each piece coming together bit by bit. He had access to the maintenance tunnels, the vents, and the outdated security systems that no one had bothered to fix. He had already made several secret trips to Cell 9C, checking on Neela, leaving small messages in her food tray, giving her hope that someone cared, someone was listening. But now, the time for secrecy was over. Caleb had to get her out. The night was quiet when Caleb finally made his move. He had memorized the guard rotations and he knew exactly when they would be at their weakest. The ship was huge with countless levels and chambers, but the lower levels, the ones where Neela was kept, were always quieter than the rest. No one ventured down there unless they absolutely had to, and that worked to Caleb's advantage. He, too, grabbed the small keycard he had borrowed from one of the guards, the one he had been watching for weeks. He slipped into the maintenance tunnels, moving as quietly as possible. The old wiring systems and dusty, unused passageways were dark, but Caleb didn't need light to guide him. He knew these tunnels like the back of his hand. They had once been used for repairs, for emergencies, but over time they had been abandoned, forgotten by the ship's crew. Caleb's heart raced as he approached the control panel hidden behind a thick, rusted door. The panel had been untouched for years, its buttons and switches long since covered in dust. But Caleb knew that this was his chance. With the keycard in hand, he plugged it into the system and waited as the screen flickered to life. It took a few moments for the system to respond, but then the door to Cell 9C unlocked with a soft click. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He moved quickly, his hand shaking as he opened the heavy metal door. The cell was just as cold and dark as it had always been, but this time, it felt different. Neela was sitting in her usual corner, her silver mask reflecting the faint light from the life support system. Her golden eyes locked onto Caleb the moment he stepped inside. She didn't move, but the air between them was charged, heavy with anticipation. Caleb stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neela, it's time, we're getting you out of here." She didn't respond at first, just stared at him as if unsure whether she could trust him. But then slowly, she stood up. Her chains clinked softly as she moved, but her eyes never left. "Caleb?" He could see the hesitation in her gaze, the fear that had been instilled in her over years of captivity. She had been told she was a monster, that she was dangerous, that no one would ever care for her. But Caleb had shown her something different. He had seen her not as a prisoner, but as a person, and now he was offering her freedom. "Are you sure?" Neela asked, her voice still soft, but there was something stronger in it now, a glimmer of hope. "I'm sure," Caleb said. "We can't waste any more time." He reached out and helped her, gently pulling her toward the exit. The chains that bound her wrists rattled, but she didn't resist. Caleb led her through the dark corridors, using the secret routes he had mapped out in his head. Every step they took felt like a step away from the horrors of her past, away from the chains that had kept her bound for so long. They made it to the maintenance tunnels without being seen. Caleb's heart was pounding in his chest and he could hear the sound of distant footsteps above them, but they were too far away to be of any concern. The hardest part was still ahead of them, getting to the ship's escape pods. "This way," Caleb whispered, leading Neela through the narrow passageways. The air was thick with tension, but they kept moving, knowing that every second counted. The escape pods were located on the far side of the ship, and Caleb had no idea if they would be able to make it in time before the alarms went off. But he had no choice. This was their only chance. They reached the hangar bay just as the alarms began to blare, loud and insistent. Caleb's heart skipped a beat, but there was no turning back now. He punched the code into the terminal, the door to the escape pod bay sliding open with a soft hiss. Inside, the small pod sat waiting, its engine already running, ready to take them to safety. Caleb helped Neela inside and slammed the door shut behind them. The pod was small, cramped, but it didn't matter. They were free. They were leaving this nightmare behind. As the pod shot into space, Caleb looked over at Neela. She was staring out the window, her golden eyes reflecting the stars. Her mask was gone now, her face finally free, finally seen. For the first time in years, she wasn't hiding. "You did it," she said softly, almost to herself. Caleb smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and pride. "We did it," he corrected her. "You're free, Neela. No one can control you anymore." Neela looked at him then, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Caleb's heart race. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was something new. It was hope. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. They had just escaped the clutches of the Empire, and Caleb knew they would be hunted. But for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt something stronger. He felt like they had just begun to fight for something bigger than themselves. And in that moment, Caleb understood the truth. Neela wasn't just escaping a cage. She was beginning a new chapter. A chapter where she would finally be seen, not as a monster but as the person she was meant to be.